Jacob ran a business scheme in Genesis 30, and the Bible endorsed it. That sentence is going to make some Christians uncomfortable. Good. Because by the end of this video, you are going to understand something about biblical wealth building that pulpits have been quietly avoiding for generations. Most Christians have never read Genesis 30 carefully. They know Jacob married the wrong sister. They know he had 12 sons. They know somewhere in his story God blessed him. What they do not know is that Jacob spent 6 years running one of the most strategic, calculated, and genuinely brilliant wealth-building operations in the entire Bible. He did not pray for a breakthrough. He engineered one. And God was in it the whole time. Here is what happened. Jacob had been working for his father-in-law Laban for 14 years. 14 years of labor, no wages, no equity, no exit plan. Laban had tricked him, underpaid him, and changed the terms of his contract, Scripture says, 10 times. Jacob was one of the most exploited employees in recorded biblical history. Then he negotiated a deal, and what happened next is a masterclass in positioning, leverage, and patient execution. In 6 years, Jacob went from a man with nothing to one of the wealthiest herd owners in the region. Genesis 30:43 records it plainly. The man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. That did not happen by accident. That happened by design. And here is what the modern church has been afraid to preach clearly. The Bible does not just tolerate strategic wealth building, it records it in detail and blesses it. Jacob's scheme is documented in the text with the precision of a case study. Every step, every decision, every lever he pulled. In this video, I am going to walk you through what Jacob actually did, the 4 principles he used, the biblical framework underneath them, and the modern application that most Christians have never considered, because nobody taught them Genesis 30 as a wealth-building text. If the Bible gave us a 6-year case study on strategic wealth building, maybe it is time we actually read it. Let's go. If Jacob's scheme is so detailed and so blessed, why have most Christians never heard it taught? Because it makes people uncomfortable. It is easier to preach the spiritual parts of Jacob's life, the ladder, the wrestling match, the name change. Those stories feel appropriately holy. They fit cleanly into sermon outlines about faith, surrender, and transformation. But the 6 years where Jacob built generational wealth through calculated business strategy? That part gets skipped. Because acknowledging it forces a conversation the modern church has been avoiding. A conversation about whether God actually blesses strategic wealth building, or whether Christians are supposed to just pray and wait. Genesis 30 settles that conversation. And it does not settle it in favor of passivity. Here is what Jacob's story tells us, when you read it without the softening overlay. Strategy is not unspiritual. Planning is not faithlessness. Leverage is not manipulation. Careful execution is not worldly. God actively blessed a man who used every legitimate tool available to him to build wealth for his family after being exploited for 14 years. Scripture did not bless Jacob despite his strategy. It blessed him through his strategy. Those are not the same thing. And that distinction between God blessing despite your effort and God blessing through your effort is the distinction most Christian financial teaching has flattened. Today we are unflattening it. 4 principles, 4 Jacob moves, and 1 pattern that ties them together. Genesis 30:25-34 opens with Jacob's negotiation. And the thing most Christians miss in this passage is how calmly, strategically, and precisely Jacob handled it. 14 years of being exploited. 2 wives, 11 children, no equity. And Laban, his father-in-law and employer, had just watched Jacob build his entire fortune through Jacob's labor and God's blessing on Jacob's work. A lesser man would have raged. A lesser man would have demanded. A lesser man would have quit. Jacob did something different. He proposed a deal. Genesis 30:32-33 records the specific terms Jacob proposed. He asked for nothing from Laban's existing flocks. He asked only for the speckled, spotted, and dark-colored sheep and goats, which at the time represented a small minority of Laban's herds. In other words, Jacob asked for the leftovers, the rejects, the animals nobody else wanted. Laban agreed instantly. Why? Because on the surface it looked like Jacob was taking almost nothing. But watch what Jacob was actually doing. He was accepting a compensation structure that Laban viewed as low risk and generous. He was avoiding confrontation. He was removing Laban's incentive to exploit the deal. And he was positioning himself for an outcome Laban did not see coming, because Jacob had something Laban did not. He had 6 years of observation, biological knowledge of livestock breeding patterns, and the favor of God on whatever he touched. Here is the principle. Jacob did not negotiate from emotion. He negotiated from position. He knew what he knew. He knew what Laban did not know. He knew what God had been doing in his life for the previous 14 years. And he leveraged all three into a deal that looked modest on paper and turned out to be transformational in practice. Most Christians do the opposite in their own financial lives. They negotiate from emotion. They accept whatever they are offered because they feel guilty asking for more. They avoid hard conversations because confrontation feels unspiritual. They treat negotiation as a form of greed instead of a form of stewardship. Jacob would call that foolishness. Here is the modern application. The average American who negotiates their salary earns significantly more over a career than one who does not. Just asking, calmly, strategically, from a position of understood value, produces measurable lifetime income differences that compound into hundreds of thousands of dollars across 30 to 40 working years. Christians rarely negotiate, not because it is biblically wrong, because they have been subtly taught it is beneath them. That teaching did not come from Genesis 30. It came from cultural overlay that contradicts the text. Jacob negotiated. The Bible recorded it. God blessed it. Strategy is not unspiritual. Position is power, and the believer who refuses to negotiate is not more holy than the believer who does. They are just less equipped. Negotiation was Jacob's first move. His second move is where the story gets really interesting, because this is the part modern Christians have been trained to think is manipulation. It is not, and the Bible is about to prove it. Genesis 30:37-43 describes what Jacob did after the deal was signed. And this is where the text gets specific in a way most pastors skip. Jacob took rods of fresh poplar, almond, and plane trees. He peeled white streaks in them. He set the peeled rods in the watering troughs where the strong, healthy flocks came to drink and mate. He timed his breeding carefully, positioning the rods only when the strong animals were breeding, and removing them when the weaker animals were breeding. The result? Genesis 30:42-43 says, "The strong, productive offspring went to Jacob. The weak ones went to Laban. Thus the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys." Now here is where modern readers get confused. Was Jacob using folk magic? Was he manipulating outcomes supernaturally? The answer is in Genesis 31:9-12, which is Jacob's own explanation years later. God explicitly tells Jacob in a dream that it was God who caused the breeding patterns. Jacob's rods were not magic. They were a visible sign of his active stewardship. The result came from God's blessing. But that blessing operated through Jacob's attention, knowledge, timing, and consistent management. That is the principle. Jacob combined biological knowledge, timing, and consistent execution, and God met his effort with multiplication. God did not multiply a passive Jacob. God multiplied a working, watching, strategic Jacob. Here is the modern application, and this is the part that should shift how you think about wealth building. Stewardship requires knowledge. Real, specific, field-tested knowledge in whatever domain you are building in. If you are investing, you learn how markets work. If you are running a business, you learn how your industry operates. If you are building real estate, you learn your market, your local regulations, your financing structures. If you are building a career, you learn what high performers in your field actually do differently. Knowledge is the modern equivalent of Jacob's peeled rods. It is the visible application of your stewardship that positions you for God's blessing. And timing matters. Jacob did not wave rods at random moments. He waited for the exact breeding windows where his effort would produce maximum return. Modern stewardship requires the same discernment. Market cycles, career moves, business launches, investment entry points, debt paydown order. All of these are timing decisions. And the Christian who ignores timing and calls it faith is not being more spiritual. They are being less effective. Here is what this costs over a lifetime. A working professional who invests $500 a month starting at age 25 and stops at 35, contributing only $60,000 over 10 years, ends up with more at retirement than a peer who starts at 35 and contributes $500 a month for the next 30 years. 10 years versus 30. Early starter wins by a wide margin. That is compounding. That is the biblical equivalent of Jacob's timing. Knowledge is stewardship. Timing is stewardship. And both are explicitly blessed in Genesis 30. Knowledge and timing were Jacob's second and third moves. Now the fourth is where most Christians get the whole concept of wealth building wrong, because we have been taught that wealth comes fast when God is in it. It does not. Genesis 30 proves it. Read Genesis 30 carefully and notice the timeline. Jacob did not become wealthy overnight. He did not have a sudden miracle. He did not wake up one morning to discover God had multiplied his accounts while he slept. He worked. For 6 years. With specific strategy. Under Laban's continued manipulation, Laban changed the terms 10 times, according to Jacob's own testimony in Genesis 31:7. 6 years of watching, 6 years of adjusting, 6 years of executing, 6 years of trusting God while staying in motion. That is the pattern most Christians miss. Modern Christian wealth teaching often implies that if God is blessing you, it should happen fast. If you are faithful enough, generous enough, prayerful enough, the breakthrough should come quickly. And when it does not come quickly, believers assume something is wrong with their faith. Genesis 30 destroys that framework. God's blessing on Jacob's wealth building played out across 6 years, not 6 days, not 6 weeks, not 6 months, years. And the entire time, Jacob was executing his strategy, trusting God, enduring Laban's manipulation, and watching God slowly, faithfully multiply what he was building. That matters because a lot of Christians do not actually fail at wealth building. They quit too early. They plant in one season and dig it up in the next. They make one disciplined move for 4 months, do not see fireworks, and assume God is not in it. They mistake slowness for silence. They mistake process for punishment. They mistake compounding for boredom, and that mistake is expensive. Here is the modern application. Christians who expect fast wealth often end up in 2 bad places. They either quit when the results take longer than expected, assuming God is not with them, or they fall for get-rich-quick schemes that promise supernatural speed and deliver financial ruin instead. Real biblical wealth building operates on Jacob's timeline. Slow, strategic, sustained, compounded over years of faithful, intelligent execution. Proverbs 13:11 says it directly, "Wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it." Little by little, that is Genesis 30 in proverb form. The Christian who invests $800 a month consistently for 25 years, showing up, executing the same decision month after month, resisting the urge to chase faster returns, ends up with well over $1 million. The Christian who chases speculation, hype, multi-level marketing promises, or prosperity gospel breakthrough events ends up with stories instead of savings. Slow is not unspiritual. Slow is biblical. Slow is often what faithfulness looks like when nobody is clapping yet. Jacob worked 6 years, and God called it blessing. Most Christians quit after 6 months because they confused slowness with God's absence. That confusion is expensive, and it is a framework problem, not a faith problem. 6 years of sustained execution. That is the pace. But Jacob's fourth move is what makes the whole story work, because without it, his entire scheme would have been something else entirely. Here is the piece that separates Jacob's story from every modern self-help wealth framework. Jacob was not doing this alone. Read Genesis 31, 5-9. When Jacob finally explains what happened to his wives, years after the fact, he is explicit. God was the one causing the breeding patterns. God was the one giving him favor in the deal with Laban. God was the one making his flocks increase. Jacob's rods, his timing, his strategy, all of it operated inside God's active blessing. And Jacob knew it the whole time. This is the framework that completes the story. Jacob worked hard, he negotiated strategically, he used knowledge and timing, he executed consistently for 6 years. And he trusted God through every step of it. The strategy and the surrender were not in tension. They operated together. That is the combination most modern Christian wealth teaching struggles to hold. On one side, you have the prosperity gospel camp, which emphasizes faith and prayer, but downplays the actual work of strategic wealth building. On the other side, you have the secular wealth camp, which emphasizes strategy and execution, but leaves God out of the equation entirely. Genesis 30 teaches the third way. Both, simultaneously, integrated, work strategically, trust God actively, execute for years, acknowledge Him in the blessing. Do not pretend your effort was unnecessary. Do not pretend your effort was sufficient. Both truths hold at once. Jacob's wealth was not purely self-made. It was not purely miraculous. It was the result of a working man in active partnership with a blessing God. And every piece of it was documented in Scripture for our instruction. Here is what this means for you practically. The Christian who builds biblically sits in a particular posture. They work as hard as any secular entrepreneur or investor because stewardship demands real effort. And they pray as consistently as any contemplative believer because they know every outcome depends on God. Those two postures are not in conflict. They are in partnership, just like they were for Jacob. If your financial life has been missing one of those halves, you now know where the gap is. Strategy without God becomes secular grind. God without strategy becomes passive waiting. Jacob's wealth was built on both, and the Bible recorded it as the model. Step back and look at all 4 principles together. Jacob negotiated from position, not from emotion. Jacob used knowledge and timing as leverage. Jacob built over 6 years, not 6 weeks. Jacob trusted God while he worked. Every one of those principles is documented in Scripture. Everyone was blessed. Everyone is available to any believer willing to apply them. But here is what the church has been quietly teaching instead. Do not negotiate. That is worldly. Do not strategize. That is manipulation. Do not plan long-term. Just trust God. Do not mix effort and faith. Pick one. None of that is in Genesis 30. All of it contradicts Genesis 30. Jacob's story is the biblical case study for integrated wealth building, strategic, patient, sustained, God-partnered. And the fact that most Christians have never heard it preached this way is a sign of how much the modern church has flattened the text in favor of easier sermons. The text is not flat. The story is not mystical. Jacob's wealth was built through documented, observable, repeatable principles. And the Bible recorded every one of them for our instruction. It is time we actually learned from it. Here is the honest question this week. Which of Jacob's 4 principles have you been ignoring? Is it negotiation? You have been accepting whatever you are offered because you think asking for more is greedy. Is it knowledge? You have been trying to build without actually learning the domain you are building in. Is it patience? You keep quitting after 6 months because God did not work fast enough for you. Is it integration? You are either working without praying or praying without working. And you think that means you are choosing the spiritual option. Pick one. Take one concrete step this week. Research your market value and prepare for one negotiation. Invest in one book, course, or mentor in your field. Commit to a consistent monthly contribution you will not abandon in 6 months. Pair every strategic decision this week with a specific prayer. One step. This week. Because Jacob did not build his fortune in one afternoon, he built it in 6 years of faithful, strategic, God-partnered execution. Jacob ran a business scheme in Genesis 30, and the Bible endorsed it, not because Jacob was especially mystical, not because he sat still and waited harder than everyone else, but because he combined strategic thinking with active trust in God, and then stayed with that pattern long enough for it to actually work. The church stopped teaching Genesis 30 as a wealth-building text generations ago, and Christian families have quietly paid the cost. In negotiations they never had, in markets they never studied, in strategies they were told were unspiritual. In years they spent waiting for breakthrough while ignoring the blueprint already sitting in the text. In generational wealth that should have been built and was not, because nobody told them the Bible blesses what they were afraid to do. That cost is not abstract. It is in retirement accounts that should be larger, in businesses that should already exist, in confidence that should already be built. In years they cannot get back. You do not have to keep paying it. The softening was taught to you. Genesis 30 was given to you by God. One was cultural, the other was biblical. Stop paying for the softening. Start building like Jacob did. In the comments, which of Jacob's 4 principles have you been ignoring? Negotiation, knowledge, patience, or integration? Drop it below, because half the builders reading your comment are carrying the same gap you are. Your honesty might be the exact permission another believer needs to finally stop waiting passively and start building biblically. You are a faithful builder. Build like Jacob did, strategically, patiently, and in partnership with God.